Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 582 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guests today are James Wynn and Craig Brewer, hosts of the ReReading Wolfe podcast, who you may remember from our feature interview back in episode 535. And today on the show, we'll be discussing Gene Wolfe's classic novel, The Fifth Head of Cerberus, about a pair of planets that may or may not be inhabited by shape-shifting aliens. This is the book that first introduced Wolfe's signature style of filling his narratives with complicated mysteries, and it also established his reputation as one of the greatest science fiction authors of the 1970s. And this will include spoilers for everything in the book, so just be aware of that. And now here's our discussion with James Wynn and Craig Brewer. All right, so we're here with James Wynn and Craig Brewer. Welcome to the show.
Yeah,
hello.
To be here. Yeah.
Good to be back, even, I should say. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. So excited to talk to you guys again. And so I'm going to start off with just a little bit of my history reading The Fifth Head of Cerberus. Is pretty short. But this was actually my introduction to Gene Wolfe when I was at the Odyssey Writers Workshop in 2001. The first paragraph of this book was given to us as an example of good prose style. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. I'm intrigued by the monkey and everything, you know. And so I went and I got the book and I read the first novella and I just loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I sort of started reading the second one and didn't really get into it and never ended up finishing the book. And I read a bunch of other Gene Wolfe things in the meantime. I read a lot of his short story collections and I've read Book of the New Sun 5 times. But every time I started reading Fifth Head of Cerberus, I would kind of get to the second story and kind of lose interest. This is all like in my early 20s. Mm-hmm. But I always meant to go back to it because it's, it's on the SF Masterworks list, and Tor just reissued it as part of their Tor Essentials line with a new introduction by Brian Evanson. So I was like, this is my time. I should really finish that book. So I went and I did finish it, although our daughter was born in the middle of VRT, the third novella. So I had to take a little 2.5 month break, which was not ideal for remembering all the details and understanding what's going on in this book, to say the least. But I have now completed Fifth Head of Cerberus, so I'm very proud of myself. Although, as we talked about last time, John Clute says your first time reading a Gene Wolfe book is your second time reading a Gene Wolfe book. So I guess by that metric, I've read this book 0 times. But so that's sort of my story with Fifth Head of Cerberus. So how about Craig? Kind of what's your history with this book?
I read New Sun first. That got me into it, and Fifth Head was what I kept seeing people talk about whenever I was really trying to figure out just what was going on in New Sun. And I joined the Wolfe list, and there was so much talk about this other book, which was amazing to me because I'd seen it in the stores and it was short. And so I was like, wow, that's different from the 4+1 plus I know there are these other Sun series out there, but then there's this one short thing. And then I actually looked it up and it's like, oh, it's 3 novellas. That's weird. So I was always intrigued. So that was the next thing I read. So I finished, I think I'm pretty sure even before I ever read Earth of the New Sun, I read Fifth Head next. And my initial reaction was just relief that New Sun wasn't a one-off, that he had other things that were like that and were, beautiful, but difficult and odd and confusing in all the right sort of mysterious ways. So then after that, I dove right in, finally felt like I could understand all the conversations on the Wolfe list, and also realized that if I thought some of the weird theories about New Sun were strange on the Wolfe list, there were even weirder ones about this very short little trio of novellas. But I loved it. I actually liked, when I was initially reading it, it was the second story that I actually liked the best, which I immediately recognized that, the first one is so immediately grabbing and the world is so intensely developed right off the bat. And you're just thrown in the middle of this amazingly weird kind of Proustian, kind of, old style novel, but with weirdness going on. But that second one, something about that style and that just very sort of brute style after what you just gone through in the first one, that grabbed my imagination. So it's always kind of been my favorite.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll just explain for listeners if you haven't read this book. So this might be a little bit of a confusing conversation to listen to, but I will do my best to sort of set up basically what we're talking about. So this book, The Fifth Head of Cerberus, consists of 3 novellas. And the first one is also called The Fifth Head of Cerberus. So it shares the same title as the book as a whole. And then the second one is called A Story by John V. Marsh. And then the third one is called VRT. It's a person's initials, VRT. And so the first one, it starts off with this very Proustian voice. The first line is basically a sort of a remix of the first line of In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. And then we get this sort of story. It's set on these 2 alien worlds, St. Croix and St. Anne. And the main character is living in this mansion with his father and his brother, and it's sort of like a brothel, and he never really interacts with his father, and it has this very sort of kind of New Orleans, kind of like 19th century New Orleans kind of vibe to it. So it's really interesting from a science fiction perspective, and then the second story is sort of, it's like this like Vision Quest kind of folk tale thing set among the sort of aboriginal inhabitants of these alien worlds, but you don't know if it's real or if it's just all fiction.
It's kind of an alien fable, and I will point out, just for people who know other writers, that it took me a long time before I really appreciated how much that second part is a lot like R.A. Lafferty. But I know Wolfe loved Lafferty, and I feel like now that second story was a bit of his homage to him in lots of ways.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I have not read any Lafferty. I got the best of R.A. Lafferty. I was actually going to do an episode on it, but then the guest had to drop off because of scheduling stuff. But I do really want to read that sometime.
I envy you. Those are such surprising stories. I mean, yeah, Wolfe loved him, but very different from Wolfe, like just in all kinds of ways. Yeah. But anyway,
Yeah. So these first 2 stories are just incredibly different from each other. So that's interesting that you like the second one more. Do you have any sense of like how common is it for people to like the first one versus the second one, or among people?
It is the consensus that the second story is the least favorite of everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean everybody, but yeah, most people.
Yeah. I think by far the vast majority of the original one is people's favorite, and honestly, with good reason. I think that that was the one that really shows off this wild stylistic talent that he had, and his imagination was just going wild there. And it is sort of perfect vintage Wolfe for all the things that people like about really imaginative, suggestive world building, combined with stories where you halfway know what's going on, and there's a bit of dreamlike things happening, but there's also this sense of a sort of old world being recreated in a new place. And just everybody loves the first one. So some people really do like the third one. I think that happens more after you sort of get into trying to solve a lot of the mysteries and stuff like that. Then that third one grabs people. But the first one is, by all rights, even honestly, even if he had never written the other 2, the first one would still be a masterpiece.
Yeah, I saw Gardner Dozois said it was the best novella of the 70s. Of the entire decade.
Yeah.
So, and I would, I don't.
Jack Dan said that really blew Gardner's mind when he saw it. It really had a big influence on him at the time.
Yeah. And we should say too, he wrote that first one, and the other 2 were. It was a bit of a mashup in that it was kind of, I'll write these other 2 to see if we can flesh it out.
Yes, I guess he showed it at a writers' conference.
Yeah, the Milford Writers Workshop.
Exactly, and then he got basically an offer. Hey, why don't you do a fix up? And and I think to me, I am most impressed that he must have written this in maybe 6 months, because it came out the same year. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, so why don't we get James, why don't you tell us about what is your history before we get too far into this with the Fifth Head of Cerberus?
I read Book of the New Sun first, and I was not impressed. I'm not saying I was impressed. I said that I told my friend who recommended the book to me. I said, he's a phenomenal creator of worlds. But I think he's a so-so writer. And, but because all of these idiosyncrasies that we all know about Wolfe, I just understood to be defects, that it was just a guy not really knowing what he was doing. And then but I was intrigued enough to try the Fifth Head of Cerberus very shortly after. And it completely recontextualized the Book of the New Sun. And from that moment, I was telling people, Gene Wolfe is the greatest science fiction writer, period. So yeah, it did have an effect on me. It helped me comprehend Gene Wolfe's style so that I could retroactively appreciate the Book of the New Sun.
Yeah, well, I'm curious because, this was, I believe, Gene Wolfe's second novel. I don't know. I think he must have been
if you want to call it a novel. Yeah.
Yeah. Late 30s or early 40s, I guess, when he wrote it. And it's just like, if we haven't made this clear, and it's a short novel. I mean,
yeah,
I don't know if it's 60,000 words. It must be somewhere in that area, but it's like, it's got to be the most complicated 60,000 word novel like ever.
Yeah. Yep.
Ever
it's
written.
I describe it as 3 novellas with a novel somewhere in the spaces between them.
Yeah. Yep.
So I'm just curious, like, who was Gene Wolfe to pull off this incredibly complicated, ambitious story relatively early in his writing career?
I think it surprised a lot of people, and I think it may well have even surprised Wolfe to some extent that he pulled it off, just because so much of his early stuff is more straightforward. Even when you have glimpses of the sort of suggestiveness and the weirdness and whatnot, this was Fifth Head of Cerberus. The novella was different from in terms of like intensity and style and everything like that. So different from any of the other stuff he'd sold up to that point. And I think probably, and I know a lot of people have kind of agreed with this too, that probably what happened is he tried this as a bit of an experiment. And it just worked so well that it ended up kind of defining what he thought probably his audience wanted. And in New Sun, in a lot of ways, can be seen as sort of, well, let's take that style and that approach to storytelling and do it with a whole epic instead of just one story. And he moves away from it later, like the later stuff. A lot of people don't necessarily move on to Wolfe's other works because after New Sun, that really sort of complicated, backtracking, digressive narrative voice that Severian has doesn't show up quite as often. But it's a much more, not tamed, but it's a much more thoughtful version of what he was doing in Fifth Head of Cerberus, which was kind of like not totally over stylized Proust, but kind of that. And Severian is he's still like that. He's just a little more approachable in a lot of ways. Yeah. But I think, Wolfe often joked that what he tried to do if he was stuck for an idea was he'd, look on the shelf and sort of copy something in his own way. And with
some piece of classic literature.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like you said, the first line is very much a nod to the beginning of the famous beginning of Search for Lost Time. And so I think probably what happened was, he's like, I need a story. He had liked Proust, and his novel Peace, his one sort of quote unquote mainstream novel, obviously owes a lot to Proust in a lot of ways. But, probably what he was doing was like, I need to come up with an idea. Let's start with that and see what happens. And turns out he was good at it and like kind of really leaned into it for a long time.
Could I just ask you, you said that this is probably what he was thinking. Did anyone ever ask him, like, how did you come up with the idea for Fifth Head of Cerberus? Did he just like play his cards close to the vest and never talk about that? Or did he ever give any indication of what his thought process had been
I'm
writing?
trying to remember specifically. James, do you remember? Does he?
No one ever asked him a question like that. That, to some extent, that kind of sounds like a where do you get your ideas kind of a thing. But I think this particular style, this particular voice, this method of storytelling, I feel like this had been the style that he had been developing over a long time. I think what the earlier stories that are more straightforward, those are Wolfe trying to produce something for the market, something that someone would buy.
Yeah.
Because when he came out with his first novel, Operation Aries, Joanna Russ gave a review of it, and she panned it in the nicest way. And she basically described it. She tried to describe its good points. And she basically describes in that review Wolfe's style, the style that everyone has come to call Wolfian. The idea of important of events being the meaning of events being explained only much later, and characters walking in and being presented with stereotypes and archetypes without even realizing that they're archetypes. All of this she described it and in her panning of Operation Aries. And I think for the Fifth Head of Cerberus and for Peace and for the Book of the New Sun and basically every novel that he continued, I think that he just said after Fifth Head of Cerberus, he said, okay, I can do this. And it's just Fifth Head of Cerberus is Wolfe discovering a confidence that he had. He knew when he was going to that writers' conference to show his story, he knew that story was going to change his life. That's what he said in his essay in the Best of Gene Wolfe.
The Joanna Russ review, if I recall, she says something along the lines of, Gene Wolfe is a better writer than this book, The Operation Aries. Yeah. And that'll become, he'll look back on this book as something he's not proud of because he's so much better, something like that. Yeah.
And she knew that he had already been nominated for Best Novella at Nebula. And she expected him to win, which he didn't. But then we got a bunch of other stories. That was the Island of Dr. Death and other stories. And we got a lot of other Island of Dr. Death stories out of that failure. But I think she expected him to win because she said, by the time you read this, it was April of 1971, Gene Wolfe will be as far above Operation Aries as Aries is above normal science fiction hack work. So yeah, that's about, if someone's going to pan something I do, I wish they would always be sure and pan it that way.
Oh yeah.
Just as I was preparing this morning, I read an introduction by Kim Stanley Robinson, and he says that Gene Wolfe, he had a day job when he was writing this stuff. And so he would get up really early in the morning and then write and then go to work. And Robinson suggests that maybe he was still in a bit of a dream state when he was composing all this stuff because of that. So
yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it really does.
Yeah. So this Fifth Head of Cerberus came out, and I'm just curious, kind of what was the critical, or like what was the both the critical and just the public response to it from what you know?
I kind of collect reviews of this, and I can tell you that I have never read a bad review of this. I could go up to my shelf and turn around, I guess, right now, and I could pull, say, David Pringle's review, or I mean, it's all good. Nobody has anything bad to say about the fix up or the original novella.
Yeah, that is one thing about it that probably stands out is lots of people will either really like or really hate New Sun for kind of all the same reasons that so many people still just love Fifth Head of Cerberus, especially the first novella, just because it's so unique in the storytelling and in the imagery that even if you're not exactly sure what's happened by the end of it, it doesn't matter because it's been such a good ride along the way. And it stands out. I mean, especially even compared to a lot of the new wave stuff that had been going on, where you did have a lot of experimentation and whatnot. This was sort of clearly something that worked for what it was doing. And so it definitely had an impact from the beginning. I mean, critics all adored it, and it obviously sold well enough that, he could not only get the contract for New Sun, but start to, have power over the shape of that in terms of like, okay, well, let me make a fourth book. And it was supposed to be a trilogy and all this kind of stuff. So it definitely was the thing that even before New Sun came out and everybody loved it, Fifth Head really did make his reputation as sort of high class, top of the pile writer's writer for sci-fi.
Well, I don't think it's hard. One thing I can say is, and that you have to grasp that Gene Wolfe, by the time he wrote the Book of the New Sun, was already recognized as among the best of science fiction writers writing at that time by his peers, by anthologists, by editors. So, I mean, it wasn't like when the Book of the New Sun came out, they said, "Oh, well, I guess he can write." No, they all knew from his shorter fiction what a great writer he was.
Yeah. Well, I guess let me explain about this. So this third novella, which I mentioned, is called VRT. So in this novella, we watch this officer in this sort of like 1984-esque dystopian society on St. Croix, and he's reviewing a bunch of documents. And so the documents are from this character, John V. Marsh, who we met in the first novella and who we're told wrote the second novella, describing how he's an anthropologist from Earth, and he goes looking for whatever remains of this supposed Aboriginal, aliens on St. Anne. And he hires a guide. And so there's this guy Trenchard, who seems to be this transparent fraud who claims to be an Aboriginal, and it's sort of like hawking relics or like artifacts that are clearly fake, that he's clearly making himself. And then he has a son who's VRT, the initials VRT. And so VRT leads Marsh on this expedition out into the wilderness in search of the Aboriginals, and Marsh is keeping this journal, and so this officer in the present is reviewing this journal and some other documents related to this expedition. And it's not clear what he's in prison for, right? There's the whole time they're convinced he's lying about who he is. He's not in jail for any particular reason that's ever stated that what the charges are. Well, they seem to be suspicious that he's a spy. Like that's
exactly
why.
Yes, like there's some sort of hidden a Cold War going on between blue and green, the two planets, sister planets.
And we should probably point out that the big thing that immediately confuses everything in this world is that the Aboriginals were apparently shapeshifters. And so that's kind of the other tricky thing, is that, who's a human, who's an Aboriginal, who's pretending to be who. And that's in the background of everything else that happens in all three of the stories, is that you're not sure of anyone's identity.
Right. And so in the first novella, actually, we were introduced to this idea called Vale's hypothesis, which is the idea that these shape-shifting aliens, somehow either murdered or somehow just replaced the settlers, the human settlers that came to these alien worlds. And since they were shapeshifters, they just now look like the humans. And maybe they were such good shapeshifters that they, in the process of transforming into humans, they just forgot that they were ever not human.
Yep.
And so maybe everybody on St. Croix is one of these aliens without knowing it. So that kind of lurks over and haunts the whole story.
Yep. And there's another theory that no, they've all been wiped out. There are none. There are none of these Aborigines left. That Vale's theory is nothing but an attempt to cope with the horrors of humanity.
Yeah, and I guess another theory then would be that the Aborigines never existed at all, that they're like, elves or fairies or something in our world, that these myths just spring up on every place that humans go.
Yeah.
Right.
So all that stuff is super ambiguous. And so even before reading this book, I had just come across a big spoiler. I think I read in the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, maybe I read. But so I sort of knew, or at least I was under the impression that sort of the big gimmick of the book was that there's a character who is presented to you as being a human being, but upon further reflection, you understand to be one of these shape-shifting aliens. And so my understanding is that kind of the first wave of critics, that was kind of their take on this book, that's what this book is about. It's about a character who you think is human, but turns out to be a shape-shifting alien. This was, I'm told, sort of the John Clute, Robert Borski kind of wave of interpretation of this book. Is that accurate as far as you guys understand?
Yeah. Look.
It's weird. It's like, it's even not so much a theory, but there's so much in the story that you feel like is kind of setting you up for that kind of story, where it's going to be like, okay, this is where the payoff is going to come, is that, yeah, we've got shape-shifting aliens who can look like humans. So, just kind of like Chekhov's gun thing, that's got to be the big twist, right? That's kind of the standard thing. And so what happens then is so much of the fun of the books is wondering, just like with the mystery, okay, is that they told me this, that's the obvious logical conclusion, so it can't be that, it's got to be something else, and you just start, that's where everything starts to get fun and confusing, is that real? Is that not real? Is it a different character? Is it multiple characters, all the way up to, Vale's hypothesis? Well, what if everybody is not who they say they are or think they are? What then? So, yeah. But no, I think you're right. Originally, that was like, I think a lot of the early stuff is trying to figure out, was Marsh replaced? At what place in the story can we tell from the journal that, he goes from being him to the Aboriginal? That was kind of, that's sort of one of the first big sort of like conspiracy theory fun kind of takes on it, is, can we isolate the place? Like, is there one page or one date where the voice changes a little bit and you can tell where that happens? That kind of thing was often, I would say that's probably early on, especially the most common kind of discussion.
Yeah. Well, and it is pretty clear, I think, that so as I said, so this human anthropologist Marsh goes off into the wilderness with this boy VRT who claims to be half Aboriginal, or maybe he claims to be fully Aboriginal, but we come to suspect he's half Aboriginal. And I think it's fairly unambiguous that VRT does replace Marsh in writing the journal around the time that there's this story about this cat biting Marsh's hands. And then he's like, now my handwriting's all fucked up because I got bitten by this cat. And that's why, the handwriting's completely different. But that's the point at which VRT, I think in any interpretation, replaced Marsh writing the journal. Is that correct?
Yeah, but the question is he a shapeshifter who's replaced him, or is he just some kid who's a con man who's just taken over someone else's identity?
Right, yeah. But basically everyone agrees that VRT replaces Marsh in writing the journal at that point in the story, right?
Yeah.
And then the question is, to what degree are the Aborigines real, and to what degree is anybody an Aborigine?
Yeah.
And so I listened, in preparation for this, to the Gene Wolfe literary podcast.
Good. I had to mention them because they do an excellent job, I think, of laying out really one really compelling way to read the whole book. Yeah. So I was going to give them a plug if you weren't going to.
Anyone who a theory, in my opinion, and I'm obsessed with them all. Anyone familiar with our podcast knows that. So, but a theory isn't a theory unless you can explain the whole book as a whole, unless it explains the book as a whole. Right? There's a lot of theories out there where what this could mean this, and those are useful, and they can be useful, and sometimes some of them have really opened my eyes. But a theory is one that explains the book as a whole. And they did that. But even if you don't buy into their theory, which I don't, then their analysis is still worth the time.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Well, let me just explain. So there's two Gene Wolfe podcasts that have covered Fifth Head of Cerberus. There's El Zabo Soup and the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast. And El Zabo Soup did 18 episodes about it. And Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast did 37 episodes about it. And these are like roughly hour-long episodes. Yep. So you're talking about an enormous amount of analysis of this one, as we mentioned, short novel. But do either of you want to sort of spell out what the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast theory was?
It's that there are no abos, that they have all been wiped out, and that that VRT is just a kid who's kind of lost, who's looking to find himself, and he's imagining himself as being an abo who has taken the place of this anthropologist.
Right. I think their theory is that there never were any abos at all. That
they go
mythological.
They go that
did
far.
They take that next step? I wasn't sure whether they had decided.
Whether or not they had fully decided in the end. I think that's the one that they end up really talking about, like, what would that mean most? And so, they take it the furthest. Very similar to, there's a fun theory of Gene Wolfe's later novel, The Sorcerer's House, which has all kinds of sort of weird, mysterious magician magic, weird things kind of going on. But there's a way to read that book where there's nothing fantasy about it at all. It's just a complicated con man doing a bunch of things. Similar kind of vein to that, where all the really weird genre type things that seem, on the border of magic in the book really aren't, that they're all just ways of talking about political and human and familial and psychological issues all at once. So that's really the core, and that's the thing where they do a great job of really lining out in all three of the novellas and with all the characters, what the consequences of that would be and what the real sort of motivations might be. And that's just why I think it's brilliant, just because it really does a great job of laying all, even if, like James, I'm not 100% convinced.
Well, let me just flesh out their theory as I understand it a little bit more. So they basically say that VRT was sort of mistreated by his father, Trenchard, who was this sort of abusive alcoholic person, and that VRT's mother sort of told him stories about the Aborigines and told him that she was an Aborigine and he was part Aborigine as a sort of like fantasy to cope with this abusive household. And he sort of clung to this his whole life. And he goes out into the wilderness in search of finding his people, basically, and doesn't find anything, and sort of constructs this fantasy, which is what the middle novella is sort of his fantasy of what the Aboriginal aliens would be if they existed, and placing himself in that sort of comforting fantasy world. And I think that's basically... And so, it's this like very compelling... It does, as you say, sort of like make sense of the of the whole novel. There's some like weird... If that were to be true, there would be some very weird hanging threads. Like it doesn't seem to explain at all the part about where Marsh kind of out of nowhere starts to suspect that that VRT is like sneaking off to have sex with this Aboriginal woman and is threatening, he's like, I would kill them if I caught them at it. And if it's all just sort of in VRT's imagination, it's a little hard to make sense of why Marsh seems to go off the deep end before even VRT takes over writing the journal.
Well, I read theirs as the postmodern Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories reading of this novel. I mean, he did write, he did publish that novella not long before he wrote this, so that's plausible. But like as you say, there are a lot of hanging threads without the reality of the abos, and as well as certain testimonies of people. And it's I don't know. it's in to my liking, it's not as satisfying as a story with that. But like I said, they did a very good job of it. And they elucidate a lot in the novel, even if you don't come to their conclusion.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So especially a lot of the larger sort of colonial politics, and how that would affect the people and their positions. They just are really, really insightful at laying out the connections between those two. But I like it too, because it sort of fits the way that Wolfe was thinking of things at the time, because you've got him writing Peace, which is like I said, quote unquote mainstream novel, which might turn out to be a ghost story. So it might be fantasy rather than mainstream. And it would be awesome if his, one big sort of confusing science fiction fantasy, thing at the time turned out really to be just much closer to a mainstream novel than something else. It's a fun twist if that's how it all worked out.
Yeah, but I think I saw, James, that you said you've actually argued with the Gene Wolfe literary podcast.
Oh yeah, guys. Yeah. Well, I have a competing theory. So, that there's that.
Like what? But, I'm just curious. What for? Have you? This is like over email, or have you been on
on their website? Although I did meet Brandon Buddha at the Hugo Awards, but we didn't discuss it though. But yeah, mostly just on the on their website.
But
and they went back.
They're sticking to their version though.
Yeah, they're not backing down. Despite the fact that I have carefully laid out the meaning of this book to them, they have not relented. They are still apostate. So,
no, we've often thought we should do. Oh, I was just gonna say, we've often thought we should hopefully someday do something on Fifth Head. I know we've done a few little things like on Patreon. I think we've got, what is it, 2 little bonus bits about Fifth Head, or have I lost my mind?
Oh, no. I spell out my theory in the episode where we early on, where I interviewed Joan Gordon. We discussed it, what it is. So I said, oh, okay. I discussed, well, I think I have an understanding of Fifth Head of Cerberus, but I didn't spell it out because, it's an interview and I don't want to spoil everything. And I've already committed to spoiling the Book of the New Sun. I don't want to spoil everything in Gene Wolfe's oeuvre since, in one interview. So I didn't spell it out, but I did tag on the end an explanation of my theory. So I did that. I keep thinking what maybe what I do is because, okay, so there's the Gene Wolfe literary podcast theory, which we just discussed. And then there is another theory that I tagged to Michael Andre Giudici, who basically says, as you described, that VRT he's like a half abo. And so there's like an integration of species. And then there is Mark Aramini's theory, which is, I don't know did he ever publish it in his book? Because I've been reading it in his write-up for so long.
Well, the Gene Wolfe literary podcast guys, their last episode is they interviewed him about his theory.
Did they? Okay, so
I listened to that, yeah.
Exactly. And so he kind of reads aboism as a kind of infection. And so you can kind of think that as the who goes there version of the story. And then there's mine, which
wait, before we get into yours,
makes the middle novella very, very important.
Yeah, yours is rather complicated. I'll save that for a little bit later. Yeah. I did listen to it. So the episode you mentioned is from October 13th, 2019. If anyone wants to go look it up, this is of the ReReading Wolfe podcast, and it's called Bonus. Joan Gordon talks about Gene Wolfe,
right.
etc.
It starts at the 1 hour, 4 minute mark of that episode.
I would also say, if you just want to email rereadingwolfe@gmail.com, James would be more than happy to spell it all out for you again.
Yes, that's true.
But what do you guys think of the Mark? So Mark Aramini's theory, is that basically like aboism is some sort of like microscopic parasite, I guess, that gets passed from individual to individual. And so there's a part where, and so he says sort of the reason that this journal written by Marsh after VRT apparently assumes his identity. The reason that their identities seem to be commingled and confused in that journal is because they've somehow become some sort of gestalt psychic mix of each other. Whereas the Gene Wolfe literary podcast theory is just that that VRT at one point decides no one's going to ever read this. And so the facade starts slipping. And then later on, he decides, oh, wait, they actually are going to read this. So he kind of like tries to rationalize why the facade was slipping early on. But I'm curious, what do you guys think of those? What do you think of the Mark Aramini parasitic theory?
Well, as I said, look, I've been a fan of Mark's for 20 years now. And, I consider Mark to be a friend, but I don't agree with him about his theory. But I got to say, as Mark always does, Mark has approached the novel as a whole and is interpreting it as a whole. So he's seeking to make it all hang together. So in that sense, it's self-consistent.
Craig, what do you think about?
Oh, yeah. Honestly, with Fifth Head, I like Mark's reading a lot less because I think it's necessarily true. Because honestly, for myself, I don't really have a theory that explains. Like, I don't have my favorite theory for what would explain what's going on in Fifth Head. What I do like really a lot about Mark's approach to it is that the way he kind of explains it as an infection and something that can. Where you can change over time, that your essence can change over time. You can be a human and you can become an abo, is incredibly suggestive of also the same themes and in a lot of ways the same sort of setup of humans, aliens, and intermediaries that you get in Book of the Short Sun, where the question of identity and how to imagine identity in a world where you really are becoming other people and other people are possessing you, and possession is something that is, you can never be sure if it's happened or not all the way. That's so much of what's happening in Book of the Short Sun, in an even more complicated version. So that's part of the reason why I find it so interesting, is that it points out a lot of how difficult Wolfe's ideas about identity really are, and how literally fluid they can be, because I think that fluidity is super important and is also super strange, given how Wolfe seems to think philosophically and religiously about other things. But then if you have this whole world where self-identity is maybe not even something to depend on, or even if it really matters in the end, it's just a wild sort of idea to stick in the middle of everything else that he does. Well, so anyway, that's, again, I'm less, just as I am on New Sun, James is so much better at sort of taking a theory and making judgments about what seems right and wrong. Whereas speaking of fluid, I'm much more like, what can I take from this idea that seems useful or interesting?
No, I'm more of a paleontologist when it comes to theories. I'm over here, digging down. I'm going to brush off all of this stuff. I'm going to pick up pieces. I'm going to try and put these bones together. And Craig is more like a guy wandering through a museum. Oh, that's a good one. Oh, I never saw that. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. That's
fair. So my problem when I listen to Mark describe his theory, it just seems like a lot to it just seems like there are no references that I remember to parasitic infections of any kinds in the book. And it just seems like a lot to hang on that idea, given the scant to non-existent references to just that concept in this world at all.
And I think it's probably too, if you actually look at the way Mark tries to make the case for it, I feel like it does come out more naturally in the way things seem to work and a lot of suggestions in the text. But you're right. If you take it as sort of like a hard and fast category of there is an infection, and, but the fact that they never talk about an infection in the book, that makes it hard. But if you look at kind of the way that he frames it and what he does find in the way things talk about, or the way Wolfe talks about things in there, there is something to it. But whether or not I think it's right, a lot of times for a good theory, I'll say that for a good theory, a lot of times what you discover for Wolfe is not that, Wolfe has
laid this out here, or he's laid it out there. What happens is you've got a problem over here and you got a problem over here, and you just kind of solve them both at the same time. And suddenly you feel like, oh, well, wait a minute, the whole novel's coming together. And and Mark does that. I do that. And I think you kind of have to do that a little bit if you're going to come up with a consistent theory of a Wolfe story.
Yeah. Well, so Mark says that his approach to interpreting Wolfe's work is to assume that every statement is true somehow. Mm-hmm. It might be true figuratively or symbolically or something, but you can't just throw out anything, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I agree. I believe that more than Mark does. So he's really converted me.
Oh, so you didn't used to believe
I first heard Mark say that. He's the first person I have to frame that, and probably over 20 years ago. And it is a watchword when it comes to reading a Wolfe story.
I think it's interesting, James, because I think I saw you say on Twitter that your theories about this book have changed. I've sort of gone through revisions.
Yeah, they kind of decade. I mean, yes. Well, here's what I say about why I think this triptych is hard. And that is because I think Wolfe himself changed his mind about the backstory a little bit when he wrote the additional novellas. It seems to me that the first novella, if you take it all by itself, what is being implied is that number 5, the protagonist, and his line, his family, are the last humans alive on the planet. And everyone else is an abo. And that's what he's saying. And because he's got all of this discussions about cloning and about the ship, about inability to change, and trying to solve the problem of why they can't change and why they can't move when they, so they got to stop and not change and not move until they figure that out. All of these little thematic ideas. And in that way, it's very consistent. And I think that when he wrote the next 2 novellas, he changed it. I think he decided, no, this is going to be a story about a family. And this is a family drama. And, so this is basically the story of Cedar Branches waving and her twin sons, Eastwind and Sandwalker. And that is, anyway, that's the way, why I think the novel, it's hard because they don't always, if you go hard into the book of, the Fifth Head of Cerberus, and you try and delve up all of its themes, and then you try to extend them, there's going to be a mismatch, I think.
Well, let me just flesh out. So in that first novella,
in other words, he cheated, is what you're saying.
Well, one is the original novella that was published in Orbit, and the other, which has been changed a little bit, is part of a trio. So they're 2 different things. That's all.
Yeah. Okay. So in that first novella, basically at the end of it, it turns out that the main character is a clone of his father, who in turn is a clone of a previous person going back, I guess 5 generations or so. And that
4 generations. That's because Aunt Janine says, he says, well, what's your name? He says, I'm number 5. He says, well, because he's been also creating all of these clones to sell in the slave market. And she says, well, that number is either too high or far too low. And then she says, oh, no. Wait, maybe he's counting the simulation, the Mr. Million as well as part of it.
Yeah. So there's this robot called Mr. Million, and he's like a mind's uploaded version of the original who started this experiment. And I'm a little vague on this point, but it sounded like basically he thought that given his genetics, he should have had a more successful life. And
because he thought he was smarter than everybody. Why shouldn't he be running this planet? And the idea is, so he keeps working on that system. He has the idea is they have a clone after clone after clone working out. But in fact, I mean, the Matra seems to have killed his father clone, and number 5, we're spoiling here, he's going to kill Matra.
Yeah, so there's this whole experiment about why have my genetics not gotten me the practical benefits that they should have, and what could be done to fix that? Is that
right? Yeah.
And so then, sorry, so how does that relate to everybody else being a shape-shifting alien?
Well, he has a conversation. Them? Okay, he has a conversation with his aunt Janine, who she says that she was the control, and David, number 5's brother, is also the control. That somehow they have why there's a control in this experiment or not. But his father Matra is every night, injecting him with stuff and putting him on drugs and interviewing him under these circumstances. So it's not really clear what he's doing, but there's a lot of references in the Fifth Head of Cerberus novella itself that Aunt Janine is an Abo who has taken the place of Dr. Aubrey Vale. And because when he first meets her, first of all, she doesn't have any legs. And you kind of get a sense that these legs of a lot of the prostitutes in their brothel seem to have leg extensions. There's another female character who has leg work done. So just all of the prostitutes are Abos. And the idea would be basically that when people come to Blue, they are, and this is what my understanding of the original novella, when they come to Blue, they are inevitably taken over at some point.
Right. I guess I don't want to get Craig back in here too, but yeah. So I guess my question is, in that original novella, do you think that Gene Wolfe, because it seems like two somewhat separate ideas, the ideas of the perfecting the clones, and then the fact that the Aboriginal aliens are all shapeshifters, is it just creepy? Like, why did he combine those two ideas in the original novella? Is it
that
just
is an
creepy?
Yeah, that is an incredibly good point. Craig, do you have an idea?
No, I do actually, and I think it kind of goes back to what I had talked about with identity before. That what number 5 is supposed to be. It's kind of like this whole story of purity. Like, if we can just perfect and purify the one thing that never intermixes with anything else, then what will come, the success will come when we have this one perfect pure being in its line. And then on the other side, you have the Abos, who are all sort of from the beginning so mixed up they might not even have an identity, because all they do is take things over to the point that everything is just a mixture and a copy. And so there's not only is there no original, there's sort of no perfection, no culmination of identity or something. So you kind of have these two strains of opposition that are kind of floating around. And in Fifth Head, that's very much kind of like a symbolic opposition in a lot of ways, and it's not very clear in the end if you're supposed to, prefer one over the other, because they both seem really problematic. And honestly, I don't know if Wolfe was doing it as like, here is the answer to what is identity and what should you prefer about it. Like, I don't think fiction works that way, but it's pretty clear that, these things are sort of like these two separate strands that are kind of pushing you to think about this issue. But then in the later
Craig,
books, then I don't know.
So I got a question, Craig.
Mm-hmm.
Why early on, when he thinks that this is the only novella there's ever going to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why put Green there as a sister planet? Why not just have all of this take place on a single planet?
On a single planet, yeah. And this is where I'll admit I haven't actually reread it in a while. so I mean, I'm still, my memory here is very much on larger themes and movements and whatnot. But it's kind of like, I think in Short Sun, which also has blue and green planets, you sort of have this at least idealized opposition between the good things and the bad things. And it seems like there's this nice clear separation that you would like. But when you get down to the nitty gritty and when you actually live your life, there is no one is pure and one is
Well,
corrupt.
I think from a writing perspective, a lot of times you need two ideas. Like one idea is not enough for a story. You know, if it's just about clones, it's kind of, well, that's kind of been done. And if it's just about shape-shifting aliens, it's like, oh, that's kind of been done. But if it's like both of them together and the weird, you know, interfaces and things.
It's suddenly a big world, right?
Yeah.
Just because, this is, look how all these clones are and all these describing. But then also, out there's a planet. Why is there a planet? Well, because why not? Why shouldn't there be an extra planet out there? Why shouldn't there be Avos running around? Yeah. But it does give the idea of change, constantly changing, versus these clones that are basically an anti-evolutionary bulwark.
Yeah.
We shall never change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is one of Wolfe's sort of overarching themes that he comes back to all the time is evolution is necessary, but evolution is also incredibly complicated, dangerous, destructive, all, those two. I mean, there's a way you can talk about New Sun is that's what New Sun is really about, is that you must evolve, you must change and grow, but growth and change is also destructive. And so what happens when both of those are necessary? So, similar kinds of themes. Yeah.
I like that. Yeah. So then the other sort of theory I want to run by you guys is the sort of post-colonial theory. Like Kim Stanley Robinson seemed to be talking about this in the introduction of his that I read. So this is basically the idea is that, when one culture colonizes another, it's sort of harmful to both of them and is erasing identity and confusing who's who, and that this story should be read as some sort of like commentary on that process. And then additionally, then there's this like intentional ambiguity of, is a story by John V. Marsh, the middle novella, it could either be a act of cultural appropriation or an act of authentic culture, depending on whether it's being written by a human or a shape-shifting alien. And that the book is deliberately ambiguous on that point because the sort of statement that it's making about colonialism depends on that ambiguity.
Craig, I'm going to go off. Craig, I'm going to go off on this thing. So why don't you go first?
No, I mean, I would put it this way. I think what Wolfe is really, really good at is creating fiction that, I guess you could say, dramatizes certain problems and distinctions. And then within that drama, you have potential directions that look like solutions, but the more you think about them, the more those solutions create more problems. And I absolutely see with the sort of post-colonial thing. Now, do I think that, I guess the more I read Wolfe, the less convinced I am, and this probably puts me in the extreme minority of people who obsess about Wolfe, the less convinced I am that there is an answer to clarify not just what is the story, but what is Wolfe's quote unquote message, like which side is supposed to win. I'm kind of honestly no longer convinced that he really thought of fiction as a way to solve problems. It was all about sort of really exploring problems and things like that. So kind of like that violates so many of the principles of, what people will talk about with world building nowadays. It's like, you must know how everything fits together in the background, or else how could you possibly tell a story? But I mean, when Wolfe's always so focused on, seeing things from one person's perspective and how they can be absolutely convinced of X, Y, and Z and be 100% wrong. And what you're going to do is watch as those two things conflict. And it's not that one wins in the end. It creates drama. And I feel like that's where I often end up with a lot of books. Even as I sit there and try to struggle through, like to figure out exactly what is he saying? How does this fit together? What do we do it? But it does help sometimes to take a step back and be like, yeah, what is this? So do I think in the end there is an answer to those questions? Like, is Wolfe saying, colonialism is bad or colonialism is good? I don't think so either way. But I think it very much looks like, it's going to happen. It may even be necessary in certain ways, but that doesn't mean that, it's going to have easy outcomes.
Before I let James go off on this topic, I'll just ask Craig additionally, what do you think about this idea that Wolfe might have intentionally perfectly balanced a story so that the ambiguity was intentional and could not be resolved, no matter through any amount of analysis?
I would say if anybody could do such a thing, Wolfe probably could. So just the way he thinks about, everybody gives him so much credit for having so much control over every little detail that, he would be the master of every possible theory and counter theory you could think of. That, creates him as a superhero, also creating something that's so perfectly ambiguous that it is impossible to figure out. That too is a kind of superhero take. I like the idea that he was shooting for that. I find that compelling. And I find it very human. And that's one thing I really like about it. So does that answer and non-answer the question at the same time?
As you do.
It just seems like, just from my reading, it seems like there's sort of two factions of Gene Wolfe aficionados, and one seems to be his work is puzzles to be solved, and the other is like, no, you're missing the point. The whole point is that it's just weird and you can't and mysterious, and trying to figure it out is just like, it's like dissecting something and killing it in the process. Mm-hmm. And so, I guess you guys know a lot more about the Wolfe community than I do. But do you agree that I think that there are those factions? Oh yeah,
definitely. And me being me, I see value in both of them. And I see Wolfe. I see him constantly leading you down either path in the same story, and sort of like trying to get you to think, oh yeah, this is obviously right. This must be the answer. There's no other way, and I'm intelligent for having figured it out. And then there's another scene where that just makes it impossible. So,
Well, I heard a reviewer recently describe Gene Wolfe stories not as a puzzle, he said, but as a game. That basically the reader, Wolfe is inviting the reader in to basically play this game in his book. And there is sure, there's an answer, but you know what? You've got to play the game, and he's not going to give you that. There wouldn't be a game if he gave you all of the answers to it.
Well, like in his introduction, Brian Evanson, I think, compares the Fifth Head of Cerberus to like a puzzle, like a physical, literal puzzle with like half the pieces not included in the box, and so there's like no way you'll ever put it together.
Yeah.
I don't know what you got.
I did put it together. So
okay, we'll get to that in a second. But so what is your? We still are waiting. Yeah. I want to hear you go off on the colonial.
Well, people. Look, and this is true. This is true for me. It's for anybody. You come to a Wolfe story with a certain number of tools to play with that you can go at it with. And if post-colonialism is one of the tools that you have, then you are inevitably going to see a post-colonial message in this story. However, I don't think I've never read anything in Wolfe that made me think he would be interested in that story. I think if there's a colonial message in the book, in the Fifth Head of Cerberus, that message is the land colonizes the colonizers. And so you can come in there, you can say, well, we're going to conquer this land. Well, the land will conquer you. The people in the land are the way they are because of the way the land is and the way the place is. And you can't, and it's a story of the humility of humanity thinking they're going to go in and claim this land in the name of the queen, when in fact all that's happened is that, you're going to go and conquer Mars, but you're just going to become a Martian.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's get into James's theory, and I guess so. Do I understand Craig doesn't have a theory per se? You just kind
of
like
a fifth head. No, I don't. And also, as I said before, I will admit that's also partly because I haven't recently. I mean, it's been over 10 years since I've really like sat down and tried to play the game and remembering all the details. So Fifth Head is definitely not at my fingertips like New Sun is.
I guess before we get into, can you say do you agree with James's theory, or is this something you guys argue about, or?
Did you even pay attention to my theory?
I did. Oh, I did. I absolutely did. But no, I don't. I mean, again, like the other ones, I definitely get a lot of things out of it, and it explains so much in really cool ways. But I am not equipped or able to pass judgment at this point. So
Okay.
let me read it again, then maybe we could talk. But
yeah.
but right
All right. Well,
now,
so James's theory. So James, you mentioned that you put a great deal of importance on the second novella.
Yeah. I think that is the beginning and the end of this story.
Yeah. So you basically, as I read it, your theory is basically that the second novella is sort of an allegory that VRT has written after he's sort of led a political movement. This is sort of reminds me of Shadow of the Torturer a little bit too, but that we're meant to understand that after the events of VRT, the novella, that he leads a political movement on St. Croix.
Yeah, the as he calls it, the 5th of September. Right.
Yeah, and that the second novella is a sort of allegorical retelling of his life and rise to political prominence.
Exactly, and I will point the middle story, and I think this is very important. The middle story. This I do assert that this second novella, and these are like 3 artifacts from the same world. That's the way to think of them. And this second novella is basically his life story written after he's released from prison. And it ends, here's something important. The story ends with the protagonist being unsure if he is Sandwalker dreaming he's Eastwind or Eastwind dreaming he's Sandwalker. Mm-hmm. And it is given, the author is someone who has never named this anywhere else in the other 2 novellas. John V. Marsh. John, which is the name of all male novel Abos. V, which is number 5's alias, and Marsh, which is VRT's alias. And so I think that's very important. So we can go deeper if you like.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, there's sort of an hour-long thing on the ReReading Wolfe podcast.
Well, I give you a summary. I'll give you a summary because I know that we have limited time here, and people, once again, you can go look it up. It starts at the 1 hour 4 minute mark if you want to. First thing to understand is you need to have figured out which is easily obtainable, not easily obtainable. It's obtainable. the name of number 5, and so. If you haven't read it, here it goes. You should have stopped listening a long time ago if you haven't read it. It's Gene Wolfe. His name is Gene Wolfe. And so as I conveyed to the...
Just to be clear, the character number 5 from the first novella,
his name is Gene Wolfe. His father is named Gene Wolfe. His father was named Gene Wolfe. So I basically conveyed this. I called this A Story by James Wynne. And I wrote this to the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast guys. Gene Wolfe, our Gene Wolfe, science fiction writer. We know he's a science fiction writer because number 5 looks on the shelves, and it's mostly science fiction stories up there where he's looking for his books. He comes and arrives. Well, let's go a little further back. We have to go back a little further. There is some sort of substance, animal, something that someone has left behind on Green some 400 years earlier. And then the French colonists arrive. They encounter these Abos who begin mimicking them because this substance basically mimics whatever is in its presence. So initially it would just mimic clouds or lava flows or water, but now it's mimicking them. And they'll eat them occasionally, but these colonists also find a substance that gives them the ability to control space-time. and they and they basically give up everything for this, to use this substance. It gives them this power. It lengthens their lives, but it also shrinks them down to these little beings known as the Shadow Children. And they so then there's and because of their power of space-time, they keep other colonists from coming to their planet. They say we bend their minds. And so they come to Blue, they colonize Blue. It's all the French colonists colonize Blue. And then on this rock, there's these two twins born, Eastwind and Sandwalker. Now, here's something you should notice is that in both of them, there is a W, just like in the middle of Gene Wolfe. And what is a W? It's but two V's. And so you have one is abducted, and this is his whole life, and telling his whole life. And then at some point, a shadow child actually opened up the gate in order not to be eaten by these other types, by these abos, and brought in the British colonists. And on this colony was, among these colonies was Gene Wolfe, the science fiction writer. And he encounters Eastwind, who he takes with him to Blue. They set up this little system. Because he's a shapeshifter, he begins to look more and more like Gene Wolfe, begins calling himself Gene Wolfe, and maybe young Gene Wolfe. And then Gene Wolfe has him slice his brain so he can become this simulation and live forever and continue his experiments, I guess. And basically when two twins are dreaming, when one is dreaming, he sees the mind of the other. So so Eastwind and is, whenever he dreams, he sees Sandwalker, what he sees. And so he's basically spying on these other abos because he's trying to learn the Shadow Children's power over space-time. And
okay, actually, let me ask you about that because I heard you say that the Gene Wolfe who starts the experiment on St. Croix wants to understand the abos telepathic.
Well, maybe the first one,
powers.
But certainly the second one does. That seems to be what he's after. He's after.
Okay, so not the one who was scanned into Mr. Million, but the clone that.
Well, since I think that Mr. Million is probably the one who's kind of overseeing all these experiments without them knowing it. Yeah, maybe he is interested in that as well.
But why is there why isn't that mentioned at all in the first novella? And why is there all this stuff about perfecting the clone line and everything?
Well, once again, because
Gene Wolfe changed his mind.
He changed his mind. Yeah. It used to be about the last human on Blue, surrounded by abos. Now it's the story of a family. Now it's the story of Cedar Branches Waving, who's going to come when she meets. Oh, here's something. When she meets R. Trenchard, the con man, pretending to be an abo. When she sees him, she knows that where her son is, where her lost twin is, because he looks like Gene Wolfe, because he's one of those escaped clones from Blue, which is why R. Trenchard says that his ancestor is the great Eastwind. He changed his mind. He changed. Once originally it was a story of clones, of not changing in a world of change, and then it became a story of this family drama.
Let me ask you, Jim, you mentioned that you've advanced this theory to the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast guys, and they're sticking to their version. Have you managed to win over any converts to your theory?
I've heard people say, "Oh, this is great." Yeah. And actually I heard a podcast who I think, surreptitiously, referenced me. He was talking about, let me tell you about this Gene Wolfe, because we had he's got this story, Fifth Head of Cerberus. It's been out for 50 years. And only recently someone comes out with a theory that explains the whole thing. And I said, I think he's talking about me. So, I mean, I think people are inspired, but not everyone is crazy, and they're not as obsessed as I am. So, if they were, they would probably insist on tweaking my theory and ruining it. So thank goodness they aren't doing that.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, so we should start wrapping this up pretty soon. But I'm curious, have I pretty much covered, would you say, all the main interpretations of Fifth Head of Cerberus, or are there any like big schools that we haven't touched on?
I don't think so. We have.
I don't. So no, I don't think so. I think that really does cover most. I mean, in the different ranges of the mixtures of the avos and humans, and sort of how that messes with identity. That's sort of the whole range of issues that most people are arguing about, and how that actually plays out in the plot, and who is what and when at what time, and So.
Okay, cool. I was also just as I was doing research this morning, apparently Robert Borski has this theory that Gene Wolfe's short story "Many Mansions" is a unacknowledged Fifth Head of Cerberus. It's set in the same universe as Fifth Head of Cerberus. I don't know if you guys know anything about this.
He says that as interesting as I find Borski, a lot of times he does have a habit of sort of mixing up allusions and reminders and things that sound similar, and then calling them, evidence for something, which makes it difficult to always track down textually exactly where he's going. I mean, I truly am not trying to say bad things about Borski, but the way that he sometimes makes his arguments, and if I'm remembering correctly, that's one of them where if you don't sort of share the same intuitions he does about things, sometimes the arguments get kind of hard to follow.
Alice K. Turner, old guard Earthlister and editor of the Playboy science fiction editor. She once compared me, said, "You should talk to Borski," and she didn't mean it in a nice way either. So, but yeah, I'll only say this. I do feel a kinship, a specieship with Borski, but I have learned from Borski to try and leave a better trail of breadcrumbs to how I get to where I've got.
I mean, there is definitely an extent to which listening to people talk about Gene Wolfe sometimes reminds you of people talking about like the Illuminati and like.
Oh yeah.
Well, if you've ever seen the miniseries The Lost Room, it was a sci-fi theories. I always look at that and I always say, "Oh yeah, Gene Wolfe readers." It's basically all of these people looking for these. They think they have their own theories about all these objects, and no one knows anything about. They're all trying to figure out how to use them the right way. And check them out. You'll see yourself if you're a Wolfe reader.
I was also curious. Apparently, Michael Swanwick wrote a short story called "The She-Wolf's Hidden Grin," which is set in the same. Have you guys read that?
I think it's generally considered to be the best of the short stories in that collection. So
yeah, and he says that what he imagined there was that basically imagine, well, what if instead of all the stuff about post-colonial and whatnot, what if this is just hell? What if all the confusion and the difficulty and the never being sure, what if that is hell? And so that's kind of the premise of his story, is that nothing here is good. It's not that you should be choosing one side over the other. It's just that everything, you're in hell. You are literally in hell.
Well, and that's that's fairly explicit in the text. I mean, there's numerous, like the 666 Salton Bank.
Yeah, it's a lot of Revelation stuff. Oh, and the beast who's been wounded in his head and yet he lives. Yeah, it's Mr. Million. So, and the 666 Salton Bank, that it's on a hand-shaped peninsula. So, number of the beast on the hand. So many things.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know I guess you could read that either literally or figuratively, but definitely, that's not a crazy conspiracy theory. I mean, that's definitely, 100% in the.
Oh, yeah. And Swanwick kind of takes that and runs with it, is really the big thing, is that he literalizes it in a bunch of ways. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, we're all out of time. I guess, do you have any final thoughts on Fifth Head of Cerberus that we didn't really get to?
Like all things Wolfe, this one is definitely, if you've never read Wolfe and are intrigued by the idea of some writer who doesn't make any sense, but that everybody keeps wanting desperately to make sense of, if you read Fifth Head of Cerberus, you'll get a sense of why. You'll either get the bug or you won't. But as I've always said, Wolfe is one of the few writers who is not a surrealist in the sense that he's just writing wild, random strangeness, but he is so amazing at writing these stories that are suggestive, that even when you are confused, you're caught up in them. And, and I'm making it sound probably even weirder than it is, but it's a beautiful story too. It's just it's told in such with wonderful language and with a really unique narrative voice. And, it really is, the first novella really is all the best things about Wolfe distilled into one piece, I think.
And I'll say also, for a writer that people are going to tell you, well, when you've reread it, that's when you've read it the first time. That can be kind of daunting. Well, in this case, it's not very long. You could probably enjoy reading this 4 times over course of a week. And every time you're going to feel like, oh, I think I've almost got it. All right. So, and then you can come talk to me.
Well, yeah, I think especially that first novella is just astoundingly good and is relatively straightforward. I mean, it's not totally baffling on a first read.
No.
So I can't recommend that first novella strongly enough. And then, if you want to get into all the puzzles and everything and the mystery, you could read the other 2. I mean, if you've listened this far,
If you listen this far, you probably already read it. But yeah.
But so definitely, it's like on the SF Masterworks list. It's on the Tor Essentials list. It deserves
for a good reason. reason. Wolfe is the only one I think who has 2 Masterworks, with the Book of the New Sun and the Fifth Head of Cerberus. So somebody thought this was on par with the Book of the New Sun, which is no faint praise.
Absolutely. I saw you guys haven't released any new episodes for ReReading Wolfe in a while. Do you want to have any updates?
Are you here to make us cry? Are you here to make us cry?
We did around a month ago. We made a big deal of like, we're back and do it. And then we both got kind of hit with more stuff, but we have a bunch of episodes in the can, and it's just a matter of getting things organized and getting little extra bits done here and there. But we have no plans to stop. Let me put it that way. And we still are talking, and we still have recorded. It's just a matter of all the practicalities, which I'm sure quite well of.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Trying
to get podcasts out when, you're already should be getting paid overtime, but you have salary. And so, so you have all that kind of situation. But no, we're definitely still doing it. We're in the beginning of the 3rd volume of Book of the New Sun. So sort of the lictor. And no, I'm still super excited about it, because I would say right now Sword is probably my favorite of the 4 books. So I write down really looking forward to getting through the rest of it.
And I write down everything I say on this podcast, on these podcasts that you hear. So even everything, because the way I'm talking now, that's unacceptable. So I've got these chapters written in advance for us to record. It's just a matter of, when are we going to record, and when are we going to edit them, and when are we going to add, when am I going to write the ad? When are we going to, get people's tags? So just,
all the other stuff we've kind of now committed to that goes beyond just talking about the books. So,
but we love doing it. We can't stop. So
Yeah, well, we're definitely looking forward to more of those. And as I said, there's the Alzabo Soup and the Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast if you want like 40 hours of more material about Fifth Head of Cerberus. Obviously, that goes into way more detail than we had time to do here.
Well, I'm sure I've already talked online about these books longer than any amount of time that you are going to listen to those. You might as well go ahead and listen, get some of that under your belt.
Yeah. Then maybe the last thing I wanted to ask you is, last time that we spoke, you said that Gene Wolfe's papers were kind of like being cataloged or something and might be available in the future. Is there any updates about that?
No, I keep trying to find out, and I occasionally, sort of on a regular basis now, send emails to the librarian collectors at the university that is momentarily left
Northern Illinois.
Thank you. Yes. They haven't responded as often lately. So, but no, there is, I'm sure they're working on it. They just have, a backlog of other collections and whatnot to work through.
We're not really in a position to critique them.
Not
getting stuff out fast enough.
But Mark Aramini, I know, is definitely keeping tabs on that because he is, frothing at the mouth to get it all of that stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. So hopefully, as far as we know, yes, a lot of his papers have been donated to university library. They're going to be organized and studyable eventually. But it's just a matter of when. And we don't really know, I don't know what all's in there. I don't know if it's drafts. I don't know if there's unpublished stuff, letters, who knows. So
Wolfe enthusiasts don't really care. They'll eat up anything from Wolfe, anything he does. But Wolfe has kind of set people's expectations about what they're going to find. That he said, well, I don't really take a lot of notes. I don't really need to. I feel like I can keep it all in my head. Really. So yeah, but I don't anticipate a Silmarillion of the New Sun coming out of that. But I'm anxious to read whatever is in there.
We just need Neil Gaiman to keep saying, "Oh, Gene Wolfe's my favorite writer." As often as he possibly can to get more pressure out there.
Right.
Yeah. And the other thing is, last time you mentioned that there was this Book of the New Sun tabletop RPG, and it looks like it's out. I looked at the website
yeah, I've seen that. I don't know anything about it. Of course,
there was the French one.
It's in French.
In French, that's the trick. And I don't know. I remember having talked to him, and he said at one point that they were looking to try and get it officially translated, but I don't know what that process looks like. I don't know if any sort of AI work has made that more likely or what. But at the moment, I'm not aware of there being an English edition of it, just in French. Yeah.
Oh, I guess I should have mentioned. Yeah, you have to speak French, but the French version's out, and hopefully there will be an English translation soon.
Yeah.
Hey, you should have started with the Fifth Head of Cerberus if he's going to do a French version.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, any other Wolfe news or anything before we wrap things up?
Just that last year, The Wolf at the Door was released, so a bunch of uncollected Wolfe stories were collected and publishable, and things that James and only a handful of other people had read in the last 30 years or whatever. But there's some really fun stuff in there. So there's still, and that's not even all of it. There's still other stories
there are still uncollected. I feel like if someone asked me to put together there's a best of Gene Wolfe collection. If someone asked me to put together a second best of Gene Wolfe collection, I feel like I could do one almost as long, every bit as good. Because there's still some really great stories out there that have not been, collected all by themselves, or have been collected and need to be in a best of collection. So,
and then I don't know if we said that the anthology that the Michael Swanwick story is in. The title of that is Shadows of the New Sun.
Shadows of the New Sun. Yeah,
right. And there's two Shadows of the New Sun. There's Shadows of the New Sun, which is a little collection of stories, and Swanwick is I think it's the best.
Yeah.
And the other is Shadows of the New Sun, Wolfe on Writing, Writers on Wolfe, which is some essays by Wolfe and on writing, and also a bunch of interviews with Wolfe.
That's very Gene Wolfe that there's two books called Shadows.
Yeah, exactly. It is
indeed. Different
indeed.
story.
It is indeed.
All right, cool. So let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with James Wynn and Craig Brewer. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us on again. Yeah, definitely.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to James Wynn and Craig Brewer for joining us on the show. This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks, or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.